No, I should maybe utilize this microphone that's in front of me. How's that, Representative?
Much better, thank you.
Great, thanks for letting me know that. So I've been voted by my two remaining peers to be the interim director. How's that, Representative? Louis Soliday was formerly helping. Thanks for letting me know for this meeting. Why don't we go ahead and do some introductions remaining peers to be the interim director? How's that, Representative? Louis Soliday was formerly helping.
Christina Longini for
why don't we go ahead and do some introductions remaining peers to be the interim director? Representative Louis Soliday was formerly helping.
Christina Longini for
some introduction remaining peers to be the
and then the director's executive assistant is here as well, and we're hoping that her schedule matches with our schedule today, and she'll be available to pop in.
Great. And did we just have someone else join on the phone? Okay. All right. Well, we do have an agenda set out for today. It'll be somewhat of a more, possibly a little more roundabout than the direct route here. We, I think, in my opinion, we're at a rather pivotal meeting for the Ocean Science Trust. As we have been meeting, our first meeting was in November of 2015. Here we are approaching November of 2019. So 4 years, meeting 2 to 3 times a year. And we've spent a lot of time doing, working through issues, developing rules and bylaws and overcoming some legal barriers. Not a lot of really exciting stuff. Been kind of some murky stuff here. I think that there's a legitimate question of what our relevance is to the state given our original charge and if we have some work to do. So it is my hope today that we leave here with some clarity on that very question. And in order to do that, I thought we might have a begin by asking, I believe Representative Gomberg is able to just give us a brief review of the last legislative session as it relates to the OOST charge.
Well, thank you, and again, good morning, Laura. I did speak briefly yesterday morning with Senator Wilblin. We were at another task force in Salem together, and I know he regrets that that he can't be on the call, although I'm pleased that his office is represented. My legislative report is pretty succinct. We asked for money, and we didn't get it. That's my legislative report, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions about that if anyone has them.
I don't know. Let's make sure we got that for the record.
Got it.
Okay, check. I appreciate the succinctness of your report, Representative. I think it really is that simple. I don't know if you have any insight from being in the legislature at that time, if there were any anything we could have done different. Is there anything that we should be aware of regarding our lack of success in getting funding, or anything else you can add?
Well, I think you have to answer that question by looking at the big picture. And the big picture is, although we have more revenues than previous years. We also have higher expenses than we have seen in other years, particularly with increasing obligations to health care, criminal justice, and to the public employee retirement system. So dollars were spread thin, and that made for very difficult decisions. And I'll also add that that you're probably reading again that that Oregon is bringing in more revenue than in previous years and more revenue than expected. But because of that, the kicker law will require most of that extra money, if I can call it extra money, to be returned to the taxpayers. So it's not available to the legislature to be allocated to good projects. I was not serving on the committees where our requests were being reviewed, and I don't know if Senator Roblin's office has anything to add to what I've said right now, except to say that we made the request, and it went into the system in early February, and at the end of June did not come out of the system.
Great. And I would just add that we did have one success with the legislature, which is we did get the fix quote that we needed to allow us to go into contract with another entity like the Oregon Community Foundation so that we can receive charitable tax-deductible contributions from private entities. And that was previously not something that was available to us. So while we have not been effective in seeking private funds for the last 4 years, we really didn't have a mechanism to do that in a way that allowed for charitable tax-deductible contributions. So that was amended for us.
Yeah, we got that fine-tuning taken care of, and that was pretty straightforward and non-controversial.
Great. Any questions?
Representative, this is Christina Volniakowski. I did have a question about funding for ocean initiatives. Were there any successful bills that provided funding for ocean initiatives, maybe outside of the OOST program?
Well, I'm hesitating because I'm trying to recall any specifics that came through. I mean, certainly there were initiatives that were moving forward regarding questions of drilling, oil exploration, and natural gas. Those questions were ongoing. The construction of the Marine Science Building in Newport, just across the water from local oceans, is proceeding, and they're expecting to complete that construction early next year. We've got staff from both the Roblin and the Gomberg office in the meeting today. Do either of you recall any other specifics that might help answer this question?
This is Gordon. I do not.
Yeah, this is Tyler from Rep. Gomberg's office. I'm taking a quick perusal now. If I come across something, I'll jump in, but I do not either.
So what we'll do is we'll take a look at the bigger picture. If we come across any examples, we'll get an email out to everyone just updating you. But off the top of our head, the three of us can't recall anything specific.
Okay, thank you, Representative. I was just wondering if ocean acidification or any other types of special projects were at least funded, but that would be great if we could get some information later on by email.
Well, I guess in answer to your question, I mean, the other thing that the elephant in the room is the large policy discussion about climate crisis, climate change, and carbon reductions, House Bill 2020, which was debated through the entire course of the legislative session, but at the end of the day did not pass, and will probably be back in some form for the short session when we return in early 2020. That was not a direct funding proposition, but it did require the some collections when people exceeded carbon caps, and the reinvestment of those dollars in clean jobs and clean initiatives. So that might fit the the criteria that you're asking about.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Good morning, Karin. We'll probably be ready for you pretty shortly. I need to back up one to do the approval of the February 15th meeting summary. Have you both had a chance to look it over? Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second? All right, all in favor? Aye. Wow, it's easy with three of us. So we just approved the February 15th conference call summary notes. All right, so moving into the meat of things here, I think what really the nexus is to discuss the OOST value proposition and relevance. And we have one of our key partners here from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to talk about some updates of what's going on with their agency. And maybe we can also discuss the potential for nexus there. So while Karin's getting herself set up, let me just kind of start a discussion amongst the board here, at least kind of going back in time, and also for the benefit of Senator Roblin's aide, Gordon. The legislature created us in 2013. We didn't actually have our first meeting until 2015. We spent quite a bit of time doing sticky legal stuff. We did have a very valuable outcome with our science summit, which was a several-day convening of, gosh, I think it was over 60 scientists in Newport for a couple of days, wherein we established some very strong research priorities for the state, which have been guiding principles for us, at least in looking at what our potential is. So that was some pretty valuable work. But here we are, and the question is, what are we going to do? So at least for me, I'll just maybe start with a couple of comments and ask Jim and Christina to chime in. When I think about what the strength is of the OOST, we knew that we didn't want to just go out and, quote, compete for funds with other entities that could do work. We wanted to be able to add value and to leverage funds in a strategic way. I believe that the fix that we have now would allow us to do that, that we could actually raise private matching dollars for funds, be they state funds or other funds. I think because of the success of the Science Summit, we've also demonstrated that we have a kind of a unique ability to convene multiple partners together, and there could be value in that in the future, not just in the state of Oregon, but across state lines as well with our partners to the north and the south. We also have a specific area of expertise in the ocean area. So while other entities in the state may be able to work on conservation issues broadly, be they land issues or watershed issues, what have you, we have a very specific focus in the ocean. So in my opinion, those are some of the reasons why we could have value, were we to be able to put those assets to work. I'd like to hear what my fellow board thinks in addition to that.
This is Christina, and I agree with that statement about our value. I also think that having an entity whose focus is on ocean research funding is really unique in Oregon, because we do have a number of different entities that are they're implementing ocean work, whether it's Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon State University, and others. But it would be really helpful to have a funding source like ours that can help be a partner with a number of these different entities. So I still see the value of us being able to move forward and try, now that we have this legislative fix, be able to perhaps look at a funding strategy that can be a longer term view and be, you always have to start somewhere, but if we can find some seed funding, I think we can gain some momentum and then be able to partner with a number of these different entities for the best ocean science research in the future.
I think that the last two speakers have covered this pretty well. I really don't have anything in addition to add to that.
Any of the members, I guess it would be Representative Gomberg, care to add to this?
Well, thank you. Two questions that I would ask of staff just to give us the bigger context. The first is, how many dollars are currently in the Ocean Science Fund that's over in the state treasury? And what is it costing for state lands to host us on a biannual basis?
I don't think that, this is Ann, I don't think that DSL has those figures yet. We've been working on that. I can get back to everybody on the DSL cost. I know that you're paying my wages, and you're also paying for the op and policy analyst's wages to do the admin work for the OOST. And then as far as the money that's sitting at Treasury, I'm not sure.
It's my understanding that there haven't been any appropriations yet for OOST, and we haven't, I think we had some funding from the Nature Conservancy, but it didn't come directly to us.
That could be.
I think they paid for the.
Well, I think not knowing the answer is a perfectly fair response, but I'd like to get those details just so we can take that into consideration when we're making our long-term plans, particularly given our current state and status.
Okay, I will add it to my to-do list and then send an email out to all of you as soon as I have that information. Does that work?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Who has oversight for those funds? Louise?
Which funds?
Funds in the Treasury.
I think there's still
There's
some,
a little bit.
yeah,
There's some.
a few thousand.
There's some few $1,000s, I think, that was left from the Lincoln County contribution, and gets a little deduction every month for fees. Yes, so there might be a few hundred left now, but I will look into that, and I will get the answer to Representative Gomberg and to the rest of the members. So, Dr. Bravey, good morning.
Good morning, and sorry I didn't catch the beginning of the meeting, but I'm very happy to be here and try and add some additional information or consideration for you guys as you're trying to determine the next steps for the OOST. I have with me Davia Palmieri, who is the Conservation and Climate Policy Specialist for our Director's Office, as well as myself, because she has been directly involved in the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund and the development of the committee that will disperse those funds if the state is able to move forward with that program. So I'll let her describe that in a couple of minutes, but I did want to take some time to go back to the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Coordinating Council, in which Jim Sumich sits on behalf of the trust, and talk about where we are with that planning process, and particularly how it connects with the OOST. other than Dr. Sumich's representation there. And I've handed you a couple of materials. One is the action plan that is finalized, that is not formally released as of yet, simply because we haven't put out the news releases to say it's done and actually posted it. But it is signed, sealed, and delivered, so to speak. Accompanying the action plan are two documents. One is a one-pager called Research Needs, which is the excerpts of the research items within the action plan. So it's nothing different. It's just a synthesis and pulling those pieces out from the action plan into a single page. And then also is the funding and timeline document, which tries to specify in more detail what it would cost for some of these actions in the action plan to actually implement it. So I do want to walk through. I had a presentation, but you guys have seen these slides before. I'm happy to give you those slides afterwards. But basically what I wanted to do is just kind of start with describing the problem. And my favorite graph to describe this problem is the CO2 rising, and along with it, oceanic CO2 rising along with it. I don't love it because of what it means for us, but I love it in that the pattern is so clear that the impacts from atmospheric carbon dioxide are very directly impacting the ocean, both in terms of dissolved carbon dioxide as well as the pH response from that, and is becoming more acidic. And we have empirical data to show that. And as a scientist, I like having those data very clearly in front of us. So the action plan that I presented to you is step 2 in the process, so to speak, and the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council presented a report to the legislature last year in September that was a comprehensive take on what the state needed to do to better understand the impacts of ocean acidification and hypoxia and start to build solutions towards creating a more resilient and prepared future over the next several decades. What the action plan brings to the table is a 6-year time horizon, a very short time horizon in terms of the more slow-moving pace of climate change and ocean change, and really says, what can we do in the next 6 years? What's within Oregon's capability to do, and what are the steps to get that work done? So like our report, this action plan, which we drafted for the governor, on behalf of the governor at her request, and she has since adopted, that report and the action plan are both organized around 5 different themes. The first theme is around science. The second theme is around reducing carbon dioxide and ocean acidification causes. The third is building resilience and adapting to the changes facing us. Theme 4 is around communicating the issues and raising awareness within the state, and more broadly than that on the issues and what the possible solutions are. And then theme 5 is around really building this issue into our institutions and our policies and our framework for the state governance in addressing this issue long term. So as you kind of flip through the action plan, each one of those is addressed on a separate 2-page spread, so to speak, and there are 3 steps associated with each of those themes and actions, and these will look very familiar to you all because you have been thinking about these issues along with us for many years now. On the science side, we're really looking at Oregon as being a wealth of information in terms of the expertise as well as the investments we've already made in research and reference sites. So continuing to put money into those in a strategic way is of high priority. And the other high priority is starting to invest more in understanding the socioeconomic impacts and vulnerabilities of climate and ocean change, so that we understand where we're suffering or likely to suffer the most, so we can address those first. In reducing causes of carbon dioxide, excess carbon dioxide and OAH, we focused really around building the communication pathways between those who focus on carbon dioxide and climate and those of us who focus on ocean and ocean acidification and hypoxia. They are inextricably linked, and we can learn a lot from each other and share both rationale for moving forward as well as solutions for how to be better prepared. And for ocean acidification and hypoxia, carbon dioxide is clearly the causal factor of excess issues, but it is alongside of a smaller but tangible component that is land-based. It is us producing nutrients, putting those in our watersheds, and exacerbating the conditions that are coming from this kind of global atmospheric and global oceanic forcing. So there is an opportunity to consider what those inputs are from Oregon and understand if there are opportunities for us to reduce those. Then on building resilience, we're focused on trying to better understand frankly, what that means for Oregon. It's a really difficult concept to understand what resilience means, both from an ecosystem perspective and a socioeconomic perspective. But we're interested in learning more about native ecosystems, native oysters, native eelgrass systems, submerged aquatic vegetation in general, and how making decisions to protect those will therefore help us in the future with the ocean changes that are coming, and developing best management practices around protecting those resources that are kind of our natural protection against changes. The fourth area in raising awareness, we hope to develop a communications plan as well as a bunch of materials to describe some of the issues that are facing us. I have a folder of more materials than I left with you. I'd be happy to share. Things focused on, what does Dungeness crab think about ocean acidification and hypoxia? What about salmon? What about oysters? How are these things going to impact individual organisms that we as Oregonians want to stay in our system? And what does that mean for my business? What does it mean for my family's recreation? And just the value of having those species. So those kinds of communications materials, but built into kind of an overall strategy for raising awareness, will bring ideas for solutions as well as support for the steps that are needed in order to address those. And then lastly, building sustained support. I already mentioned we're focused on, in this first phase, looking at the agencies as one of Oregon's greatest assets in terms of workload capability, expertise, and regulatory framework to put in place programs and if needed, regulations in order to prepare us and continue to adapt to what we're already seeing now. And so there's a number of steps in this biennium, including budget preparation, planning steps, and reporting back to the legislature that are captured within this action plan. So that's what the council has outlined for the next 6 years, and I'm happy to take questions on that or talk to you guys later as you have time to reflect on it. But specific nexus with the OOST really lies around research needs, and the OOST being Oregon's tool for investing in nearshore research needs, partnering both state funds and capacity and potentially outside funds, outside of state sources. And so the research needs that are listed in this document that I've left with you complement very nicely many of the priorities that the OOS has identified over the years. There's not perfect overlap because ocean acidification and hypoxia is one set of issues, but broadly it's about nearshore, understanding the nearshore system, understanding resilience in the nearshore system from the frame of OAH. The other nexus, of course, is with the dollars to pay for the research and to pay for the other steps that we need taken, and thinking about how the state is prepared or not to take funding from outside sources. And this has always been a difficult issue with Oregon for a number of reasons, one being that there's a lot of sensitivity, as you all know, around agendas being driven by outside sources of funding. And the OOST, in part, was created to address that issue and be a firewall between what might be strings and outside agendas and what the state's priorities were for addressing nearshore research needs and management needs. And so the funding and timeline of this funding is what we are estimating we need. Each item that has a cost associated with it has a range of dollars to give you an idea of magnitude, but we don't have very specific budgets for any of these particular line items. But it gives you a sense of what we do think we need in the short term. And the state doesn't have the funds set aside to do this work. And so that really raises this question of how we're going to get that work done. And grants are always an option, and we have been successful in getting grants within the agency for some nearshore work outside of state funds, particularly from federal sources, but also from foundation sources that have been spent outside of the agency budget, but towards agency priorities. And so, you know, coming into your discussion about whether the OOST still has a role in Oregon, I think absolutely yes, that we do need that firewall. We need an institution that can take, that can leverage state dollars that are not sufficient to meet our need, bring in additional dollars, and spend some of the work that is needed to choose how we're going to set our priorities in the state. And so I think that's a really important function. And yet I am very clear how challenging it is to have an OOST without a budget. And so it's not an easy issue to address. So that said, I want to pivot to the legislative session. I just heard a little bit of Representative Gomberg's description of some of the issues that came up, and you may have already talked about Senate Bill 260, which was specific to ocean acidification and hypoxia priorities. And number one, I want to thank Representative Gomberg and Senator Roeblen for their leadership in bringing that to the table in the first place. It is unfortunate that it was not passed and funded. All of the objectives within the bill, it was a series of 13 projects that were lined out in that bill, are captured in the action plan. And so those are still in our set of things that we hope to do over the next 6 years. We just don't have the funding yet. But
So,
those
Karen, just for
priorities
clarity for everyone, how much was the ask? And it was kind of specific to ocean acidification and hypoxia. How much was the ask on Senate Bill 260?
Yeah, it was just under 2 million. It was 1.9. And so I think that there is interest from a variety of legislators, even outside of the Coastal Caucus members themselves, on continuing to talk about whether there are state funds to put towards some of the priorities in Senate Bill 260. But for ones that the state wants to provide match or partial funding, we need a mechanism to bring in additional dollars in a way that makes sense to Oregon. And that's where the OOST comes in my mind.
And so with the Senate Bill 260, was the funding a policy option package with ODFW, or who would be receiving the funds in order to fund that research?
That's a great question, and I don't have the breakdown at the top of my head, but there were funds that went directly to OSU, there were funds that went directly to ODFW, and then a little over $1 million was earmarked to come to the OOST for distribution through competitive grants. And so those would have, in my mind, would have been put out to university applicants, maybe NGO research applicants, things like that.
So, Karin, hypothetically, if that would have been funded, or if maybe in the next funding cycle something like that gets funded, OOST was called out as a pass-through for some of those funds. If OOST didn't exist, are there other entities that could do that job?
That is a good question. Yes, there are other entities that could do that job. I think that the OOST is unique in having the specific policy frame that it does relative to other institutions. Oregon's very lucky to have Oregon Sea Grant within the state. It's a very strong program. They're very good at conducting competitive grant process. They have their own competitive grant process to let out, and all of their programs are built. They don't have staff sitting around waiting to do this additional work. I actually thought that Shelby Walker would be here this morning, and she may yet arrive, but she is very good at thinking through some of these issues. She's very willing to be part of the solution. But frankly, we need more capacity to do the work just of getting the money out there. And then the other piece of this is that the OOST has spent the time to do the strategic planning around nearshore research needs. And Sea Grant has done that as well, and there's a lot of overlap, but it is a unique perspective. The other challenge is that Sea Grant, being within the university system, is very much subject to costs and fees associated with running their grant programs that are significant.
Okay.
That shouldn't be the only barrier, but it is a consideration.
So, as you've been out there leveraging funds outside of the state legislature for this work, either federal or otherwise, if OOST were to take on, if OOST were to continue, which we don't know yet, and take this on, I mean, how would you describe that climate out there in the funding world? Is there enough opportunity for an organization like OOST to capture
funds? Yes.
funds?
Good question, and I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't, nor do you. I think that the climate is good. I think that there have been a number of entities that have been watching the OOST for a number of years, waiting for all of the pieces to fall into place. And my understanding of the pieces are, one, the problem that you all solved with the bill this past legislative session to be able to partner with outside 501c3s so that there is an entity that could do competitive grant administration, could manage the funds coming and going, and so that was a great step forward. That capacity hasn't existed within DSL to date, and they don't have the capacity or the expertise to do that particular piece. And so now we have that. The state of Oregon has that. The other piece that has been that has yet to fall in place is state match, and saying, okay, is Oregon really serious about taking these steps forward. And with state match of some level, you know, it could be 5%, it could be 50%. I'm not talking about how much needs to be dedicated, but in order for these outside sources to get serious about putting money in, they want to see a commitment from the state to partner and to really be serious about the work. And that hasn't been successful for all the reasons you've already talked about at this meeting and many others. And so I think we're close to making it happen, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay. What are some of the federal agencies that have helped support some of this work? Has NOAA participated, or?
Yeah, so we have received the work that I'm thinking of just off the top of my head right now is a Saltonstall Kennedy grant that we received to do fishery independent surveys in the near shore. That is traditionally a very difficult funding source to get a grant from. It's very competitive. And Oregon was successful in getting a grant because of the work that the OOST has done on raising awareness about nearshore research needs, and the agency has done around how important fishery independent assessments are in terms of fueling federal stock assessments that fuel our quotas and our management guidelines coming from federal and regional management. So that whole system is what allows us to go out on a boat on a Saturday morning and go and get a black rockfish, or go and get a halibut, or go offshore and use long leader gear to get now canary, a rebuilt species. And so those fishery independent surveys are critical for keeping that whole system sustainable and accessible to harvesters. So anyway, we got funding to strengthen fishery independent surveys on the West Coast. It's a one time for Oregon. It's the kind of thing that we need to do on a more continuous basis in order to keep that pipeline kind of humming, so to speak. So Saltonstall Kennedy is through NOAA, and is an example of the types of funds that we can get because of the thought work that we all have put into what our priorities are.
You mentioned the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund earlier. Given that that is a conditional appropriation to the state, if federal funding was to come in, would OOST be qualified to get some of the money from that pot, the OCRF pot? Or, I mean, I was just curious because you mentioned it in the beginning.
That's a great segue, and I would love to invite Davia to kind of take a step back and explain it, and then we can talk maybe about the nexus of the two, because there are, again, a lot of overlapping goals and institutional problems and frameworks, and I think there's a lot to talk about.
Yes, there is a lot to talk about. So I'll just sort of zoom us back and try to get the background so you guys understand what that Conservation Recreation Fund bill is and did. So it's House Bill 2829 from this session, created the Oregon Conservation Recreation Fund. It created an advisory committee to the Fish and Wildlife Commission that will weigh in on how those funds are expended. And then I think one of the key things to talk about is that it created a conditional appropriation to the fund of $1 million general fund. And the condition there is that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has to deposit $1 million from non-state and non-federal sources into that account before we can access the general fund dollars. So in theory, it is a $2 million pool of funds. It's not limited to $2 million, but before we can spend any of it, we have to raise $1 million from the private sector. The other, I think, major thing to know about the bill is that it sunsets the fund at the end of this biennium and requires us to raise $1 million and then spend the $2 million this biennium.
This biennium.
This biennium.
This biennium.
So we're already 8 weeks in or so. And so Representative Helm was the original bill carrier on this. The amendment that made it this biennium and created the match requirement was added at the very end through Ways and Means. And so Representative Helm, I think, does have an interest in trying to make some adjustments in the short session. But we are at Department of Fish and Wildlife moving as fast as we can to deliver on some of the requirements of the bill. I think the most straightforward one is standing up the advisory committee, so I'll start there. The Fish and Wildlife Commission is going to consider rulemaking that creates the advisory committee, determining the number and the geography of the representatives on that committee at the October 11th commission meeting. So that's kind of the fastest we can do that. And then the governor has to appoint members to that committee. The notice of proposed rulemaking that went out on that says there'll be 9 committee members, and each of those members will have demonstrable expertise in one of the 9 ecoregions of the Oregon Conservation and Nearshore Strategy. So the Nearshore ecoregion is one of those 9 seats. So we'll be looking for people with biological expertise in those ecoregions to understand what the highest priority key conservation issues are and the highest priority habitats within those ecoregions to be able to make sure that we're putting that money to the best places. So I think there's probably a role for OOST or some nexus for OOST in that nearshore seat on the advisory committee, and that work to prioritize has been done, as we talked about. And then the other part of this is the raising $1 million. And so I think we're in a decent position with that, in that the Oregon Wildlife Foundation has volunteered to help raise that money. And so it solves a few of the issues in that the foundation is actually going to do the bulk of the fundraising and do one big donation to the department to deposit into the account to help us with some of those issues about can people get a tax write-off if they donate to the government? And if we don't raise the $1 million and can't access the general fund, does the state have to give the money back to donors? The foundation will be able to spend those dollars on the highest priority conservation need, no matter how much we raise. So that means that there'll be a positive effect of the fundraising campaign, even if we don't hit the $1 million match.
Question.
Yeah.
So if you raised $500,000, could you access $500,000? No, it's $1 million or nothing.
Correct. That is at least.
At least one.
Correct.
Minimum of $1 million.
In order to access the general fund special appropriation. So to the question about could those monies be spent on the priorities of OOST, I think absolutely yes. The purposes of the Conservation and Recreation Fund are very broad. ODFW intends to emphasize implementation of the conservation and nearshore strategies and connecting Oregonians to the outdoors. So the advisory committee will be determining how the money is spent, so I can't pre-describe what it'll be spent on, but I can talk about what ODFW staff's priorities will be in making recommendations to that advisory committee. And our intent is to make recommendations that they focus on restoration projects, things that have impact on the ground in recognized priority areas, things like tide gate replacement projects on the coast. And then the second bucket of work that we're going to recommend is science and research and monitoring to fill some of the key data gaps that we have in understanding a lot of Oregon species that just have not been prioritized in the past. And that certainly includes the nearshore ecosystem, kelp ecosystems, and other ocean ecosystems like that. And focusing on data monitoring, I think, has a good nexus with OAH and the data we need to be collecting to even understand the patterns and what's happening throughout the year and through time. And then the third category is connecting Oregonians to the outdoors. So communication opportunities to help people understand the impacts of what we're seeing on the ground. Some of the materials that Karin was talking about would fit into that. And I think also opportunities to engage the recreation industry in being conservationists and understanding the ecosystems in which they recreate. So that's going to be ODFW's recommendation to the advisory committee. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I have two follow-up questions. One, why were federal funds not included as a part of that match? Is it just because it's too speculative with Congress passing Recovering America's Wildlife Act?
I don't think I can answer that question. You'd have to, I think, ask the legislators about their intent there. We did follow up with Legislative Counsel. The way it's drafted, it says, from funds other than state or federal sources, and so we weren't sure if other than modified state or modified state and federal, and Legislative Counsel clarified that it includes federal funds, that we cannot use federal funds. I think if the Recovering America's Wildlife Act were to pass, it would be an easy ask to remove that portion of it and look for ways to match that. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act is a bill in Congress right now. It's I can't remember the bill number. It's HR 3472 or 3742. And it's in the House of Representatives right now. It's got 110 co-sponsors, including 4 of Oregon's 5 representatives. And it would dedicate $1.3 billion a year to implementing the state wildlife action plans, which would include the Oregon Conservation and Nearshore Strategy. So that for Oregon would be about $23 million a year in new funds for fish and wildlife conservation. And that would require a 25% match. So a lot of people have been thinking of the Conservation and Recreation Fund as an opportunity to find the state match.
So just one more question. So you mentioned before when I was at that ODFW meeting in the spring about the resilience planning and mapping of which species under expected climatic changes and conditions will how they'll be doing in different places. Does that include nearshore species and ecosystems, or could OOST fill a gap that might exist there?
I think the context from earlier this year we were talking about was habitat based, and we were talking about ODFW's water program and the efforts they're putting into mapping freshwater. And finding our priorities in the long term. Where are we going to have climate refugia conditions and cold freshwater? And so, yes, I do think that there would be a great opportunity for the OOST in looking at climate resilient habitat in the marine environment. And I think that's something that Karin touched on a little bit too. So I do think that is a great role for the OOST.
As another example, and probably not part of the terrestrial freshwater discussion, we've had a number of initiatives over the past 10, 20 years at ODFW to do some of the habitat assessment work, and that's fallen into a couple of different categories. There's been mapping of reef systems in partnership with Oregon State University and Chris Goldfinger's lab, doing multi-beam side scan type work to really get good quality understanding of the habitat, which is harder to do in a marine system than in land where you can kind of look at it. So we need to get a lot of money to actually look at those systems in the ocean, but those have been really beneficial to help us build species habitat relationships to better assess the species we're interested in protecting and harvesting and understanding and stewarding. There are some habitat map projects that remain to be done, including Rogue Reef, which is one of our most important reef systems on the coast, and that is yet to have a high resolution map. So things like that certainly fall into the same kind of category and could be a good nexus for partnering federal funds and state funds and private funds to achieving some really quality work and outcomes.
So thank you, Davia, for coming and sharing that with us. I too, like Christina, raised her eyebrows. You have to do what in what amount of time? That was really the conversation Karen and I had maybe 2 or 3 months ago, just having coffee, and I thought, wow, this could be a job for the OOST. Like, we'll wonder twin power this. But there's a lot of stickiness here, and whether or not it's a good fit or even possible is something I think we might need to figure out a few what ifs here today, because before you arrived here, we kind of premised this meeting with, this is kind of a do or die meeting for us today. Like, we've got to really see, like, do we have something that we can stick to and move on, or is this it? So I guess a couple of questions that kind of get to that, and these might not be something that you're prepared or able to answer right now, but a key question I would have is, you have a relationship with Oregon Wildlife Foundation. They've committed to raising this $1 million to match. Do they need help? Do they want help? Is there room for more than one fundraising partner?
Yes.
Yes, and yes. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I think there certainly is opportunity and space.
So any funds that were raised would need, when you say deposited to the account, that's the ODF&W agency account in the Treasury, is that correct?
It's a separate account, the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund in Treasury.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, if Laura Anderson wants to make a charitable contribution towards this process, I would make a donation to the Oregon Wildlife Foundation. I'd get my tax deduction. They're going to bundle everything and move it over all at once. Is that the mechanism?
That's correct. You would also be able, if you wanted to send a check directly to the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund. Mm-hmm. We would be less guaranteed that we'll be able to spend it with matched funds.
Oh, understood. So theoretically, Oregon Conservation Foundation would work the same way for OOST if that relationship were to be developed. If I wanted to give money, I could give it through, if OOST were to be a conduit, I could give money to the Oregon Conservation I'm sorry, did
Oregon
I say?
Wildlife Foundation.
What I meant to say was the Oregon Community Foundation.
Oh, Oregon
because
Community
they would
Foundation.
be our fiscal partner.
Yes.
And we would act in that same way to facilitate that, and then OOST would need to transfer said funds over. So the mechanism is there. There is a need there. Oregon Wildlife Foundation, I don't know much about the entity, but the little I do know leads me to believe they have a real strong hold in land-based fish and wildlife issues, maybe not as strong in ocean issues, which is, again, one of our uniques that makes us valuable. Yes, I should ask if there's any questions. Representative Gomberg, based on the presentation, did you have any questions for Davia or Dr. Braby?
Nope, we're good. Thank you so very much.
Okay. We had a couple people join us in the audience since we started. I think we'll continue with some questions and then maybe take a little break. But before we do, can the two folks in the audience introduce yourselves, please?
I'm Peggy Joyce. I'm Coastal Portfolio for the League of Women Voters. I'm a volunteer lobbyist. I was there to see to it that bill got into the hopper, and we were told that it was going to get funded, but surprise, surprise.
So for those on the phone, if you couldn't hear, Peggy Joyce with Oregon League of Conservation Voters and
League of Women Voters.
League of Women Voters, thank you. And we have Shelby Walker joining us for Oregon Sea Grant. So, okay.
I'm Laura.
Yes.
This is Gina Carter. I joined on the phone.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad you could join us, Gina. So, this was, the nexus of this is why if we're going to do something, this could be it. This could be something that we could connect with. One of the things that I like about this is there's already $1 million put up from the state of Oregon. It didn't come to OOST, and it's not all for Ocean, not by a long shot. We'll be happy to take some portion of that towards our agenda. But I would, I'd be remiss if I didn't see this as an opportunity for the OOST to dig into something immediately, because the need is now. Granted, there's going to be a lag in getting appointments and so forth made, but I would hope that would happen pretty quickly. How do you think, when you talked, Davia, about some of the priorities that staff would be putting forth, and Karin, you talked about some of the priorities that were unfunded from the Ocean Acidification Hypoxia Council, is there any overlap there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the department has had a portfolio or wish list of objectives for new money for many years, and it evolves over time, but it's the same bucket of issues, and fishery independent surveys, monitoring, communications, all of those issues are common amongst the Oregon Conservation Recreation Fund ideas, as well as the marine program ideas, and with the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Plan that we now have in front of us. So there's synergy. I wouldn't say redundancy. There's synergy. In some cases, the objectives are exactly the same, but it's more of a Venn diagram than an either this or that kind of situation. I think that there is a unique character for the OCRF. I need to come up with this new acronym. OCRF and the OOST, and that is that the OOST, by definition, is interacting with a lot of entities other than a single agency, and the OCRF is interacting with ODFW. And as an agency person from ODFW, I love the support, and I want that to be a successful mechanism this biennium and into the future. But in terms of the broader political view, Oregon has more needs than just ODFW relative to ocean resources. Mm-hmm. And so I think the OOST still has a unique slice of the pie and a unique perspective. Again, it's not competition, but it's very complementary kinds of overlapping, but not exactly the same kinds of purposes and outcomes.
I think that's a really important observation, because there is a direct tie with how the OOST can benefit an agency, but we do have broader multi-client vision. Something like this would be by rule, by the way the legislator wrote it, it would be money that would go directly to the agency, but that shouldn't tie OOST's hands in broadening the scope on our side, so that Venn diagram kind of expands out this way. So if, for example, we said we're going to take $100,000 of this piece and try to fundraise for that and match, and then there's 200 for ODF&W, it doesn't stop us from raising another 50 or 60 that we could use for other partners that would be complementary to thematic state priority. So when we talk about the nearshore, one of the projects, and I'll just speak specifically because I've been having this conversation with a lot of folks recently. Andy Lanier and I were talking about nearshore and ecosystem-based management and others about this this ability that OOST could have to convene California and Oregon partners together to work on particularly Southern Oregon nearshore issues around abalone as a keystone species right now, which is part of the conservation strategy. So I could easily see, I couldn't easily do, but I can easily see generating enough interest around this so that an appropriate set of monies would go towards ODF&W's expertise in doing surveys and indexing populations and developing fishery management plans around abalone, where other monies could go towards other kinds of habitat suitability for sea otters, for example, which we know one of the nonprofits, the Alaka Alliance, has an interest in, or other OAOH projects through Sea Grant or Oregon State University. So I think there's a potential here for a lot of partnership and convening around something like this. I would like to see if this is something that we want to pursue.
So I needed just a clarification about the funding part, because I totally applaud what you just said. That's what I'm thinking as well. But if we engaged in fundraising on behalf of some of the ODFW priorities that you've listed, and we are successful in, let's say, $100,000 that could go towards that $1 million match from non-federal sources, that would be kept in our account until such time that the rest of the funding would be secured, so that literally June 29th, at the end of the biennium, if we see that the million, that we're $900,000, then we would transfer that funding to whom?
You would be able to transfer that either to ODFW directly or to the Wildlife Foundation.
I see.
Your choice. I also think the foundation might be willing to hold the funds contingent upon them reaching $1 million and then give them back to you. I think there's many different ways that could take.
Got it. Well, I really support that initiative. I think that is, I think it's something that we very much believe in terms of the priorities that you've laid out. We hoped that, we would have our own funding to be able to support part of that. But I think a really important point that Laura had was that, we're not just raising funding for ODFW. There are many other entities out there who are also doing high priority research. But to me, it seems like this is an amazing opportunity to get in the game and see what our abilities are to be able to leverage some funding through maybe some private donors or other sources of funding that we haven't even been able to explore. Because part of what's been holding us back is, number one, the mechanism of being able to raise outside funds. But second of all, we were pretty much waiting for the state of Oregon to put some skin in the game here, to give us some seed funding to enable us to do that fundraising. Because we don't have any administrative support other than the volunteer work from DSL, which we are very appreciative of, by the way, underscored, exclamation mark.
It's my pleasure.
So, we're very grateful that we at least have a little bit of support here. But, fundraising does take some time, and we all work. But from my perspective, having a carrot out there, something that can help us maybe refine our own strategy for how we would look for funding, how, the fact that there is a mechanism in place, there's a list of priorities, there's, the OCRF that has this opportunity already, and the fact that it's a carrot with the matching funds, nothing like a little leverage to get people excited. So I feel that Laura, you really articulated it very well, that if there is an opportunity to partner in this, I would like to give it a chance.
And I would second that. I think this is our opportunity to see if we can break through this stalled situation we've had for a year or so and move this forward.
The one update that I would share is that with the short legislative session coming up, senators and representatives are both extremely limited in the number of bills that they can introduce themselves, but there are committee bills as well, and Senator Roblin wanted us to know that he's working on getting a funding bill in the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee, but it isn't his decision at the end of the day. He has to work with the committee chair. So there's no certainty that a bill would be introduced, but he hasn't given up on seeking funding from the state for the trust.
Thank you. That's good news.
All right, well, looks like we have a job. Just in kind of touching base with where we're at this morning with the agenda, there's one other project of interest to the OOS that we've been tracking that I know Karin is very astute in, but Shelby Walker as well, and that's the gap year monitoring in 2021 for Oregon Marine Reserves during the assessment period. This is another thing that I think would be worthwhile to discuss today because we only meet a couple times a year, as it is, maybe 3. And maybe after that we can have public comment, and then we'll take a short break and then come back and finish up business. Does that sound all right? Shelby, would you be interested in joining up at the front, and maybe we can just talk a little bit about, again, I'm not really looking for like a big update on the whole scene. We're trying to really dial into what can OOS do to support the state in some of these issues. So let you go ahead with that.
You can stay or you can go. It's up to you.
Stay.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Laura, for the opportunity to come and speak to you all. Just a brief update as to where things stand with the Marine Reserves assessment. This issue was raised with OPAC. It's actually been raised a few times, and really focuses on both the assessment itself as well as the gap in monitoring for ODF&W as they prepare for the assessment. And what it boils down to is the Senate bill is requiring an assessment of the Marine Reserves to be done by a chosen university. No funding was provided for in that legislation, and STAC, the Science and Technical Advisory Committee, thinks it's fairly unlikely that any chosen university will actually conduct an assessment in the absence of funding. So, splitting these two issues apart, we have both the Marine Reserves assessment, for which STAC has come up with an estimate of approximately $200 to $250K to actually conduct that. And this is something that we hope to discuss with the Coastal Caucus, ideally at their upcoming meeting during the legislative session or the legislative days, or at one of their upcoming meetings. The timing of this is such that for the assessment, we really need to determine where that funding is going to be by effectively the end of next year, if not well before then, because we need to be working with a fiscal agent and get all of the mechanisms in place to actually put an RFP out and conduct the proposal review process, get the chosen universities selected, so that they will be on board by the time the synthesis report by ODF&W is complete and ready to be reviewed. So that's the assessment piece. For ODF&W, because they will be working on developing the synthesis report, basically looking at the Marine Reserves program, both the program implementation as well as the impact of the Marine Reserves, they're having to shift resources to actually put all of that together. As a result, there will be some gaps in monitoring, which have implications for both the assessment as well as the long-term monitoring for the Marine Reserves. And this focuses on their ROV missions in a couple of the Marine Reserves, as well as their hook and line. And updated numbers from ODF&W indicate that that is about $237,000 split over 2 biennia. So that's where things stand right now with respect to both the monitoring gap as well as the assessment gap. There have been conversations with foundations, but as you noted in your previous discussion, other foundations or nonprofit groups aren't likely to come to the table until the state actually puts some money towards this. So basically, they're conversations at this point, and probably nothing's going to happen until there is some kind of commitment on the part of the state for the assessment.
Who's involved in the assessment?
So basically, it is a chosen university within Oregon, though the team itself may be from outside of Oregon and will probably need to be just because Oregon's not that big of a state, and we have a lot of people who work in the Marine Reserves, and we need to navigate conflict of interest issues. So a team who are well-versed in the issues associated with the Marine Reserves, both ecological and human dimensions. And then, again, kind of ballpark estimates, them basically sitting down, looking at the synthesis report that ODF&W is putting together, as well as any additional information that may be out there, primary research that's being done by ODF&W partners, anything along those lines that will help them assess the program implementation and the impact of the Marine Reserves. And the timeline is effectively, they begin their work, background work, in August of 2021 to just get started on getting acquainted with the information. The synthesis report is not actually due until December of that year. So then they begin their dedicated work in January of 2022. There are a few check-ins with STAC during that period, and a final draft report is due to STAC from the university at the end of August, with the draft report to the Oregon legislature in October, with a final report to the Legislative Assembly in March of 2023. So basically, it's a team of scientists who are sitting down and looking at this, and again, looking at any other literature, conducting any additional data analysis if they see a need, and evaluating the Marine Reserves program and impact based on the criteria that STAC has been developing over the past couple years, all of which are based on the OPAC recommendations that put the Marine Reserves, or that helped shape the Marine Reserves in the first place.
Okay. Just a quick follow-up. So in California, have they done these kinds of assessments or evaluations of their Marine Reserves?
California has done their baseline, but to the best of my knowledge, they have not actually done an evaluation of the impact.
Okay.
So with respect to the OOST, hopefully when we get a chance to speak with the caucus and sort of figure out hopefully a path forward, a couple of the mechanisms exist with respect to funding if the state agrees to put forward funding for the assessment. You know, STAC is not a body that can accept funding. This would have to go either through an agency like DLCD, which supports OPAC, under which STAC exists, or to the trust. And in the conversation that I had with Laura, I basically asked, well, is the trust in a position to actually accept this money from the state? Because that would also be an ideal opportunity should other foundations, see the state money coming in and then also want to help support this effort. The trust was sort of set up exactly for that. But if this is the go no go conversation for the trust, I wanted to just put that out there and see if this is a viable option.
Well, it's interesting, Shelby, because in my opinion, if it were just this, I'd probably say, do we want to hang out for another 3 years just to be there in case we're needed for this? And we might say, I don't know. But since we have looked at each other and said pretty squarely, we're going to commit to this at least 2-year, working through this 2-year fundraising challenge with ODF&W, we will be here. And so this is something that at that point we will have some experience in administering some funds. So what I hear, if I'm hearing you correctly, is there's about a $500,000 shortfall. That's kind of a 2-entity, 2-client. One is ODF&W, another is a university. This isn't, one of our broad partner RFP situations. This is pretty focused, pretty specific. But the timeline's out there for this beyond the funds from the Conservation Recreation Fund couldn't be used for this because the timing doesn't match up. You've got to spend yours in 2 years, and this starts in about 2 years. Is that correct?
So just to clarify, we need to know whether or not the funding is actually there pretty much by the end of next year.
Okay, yeah.
So that's got to be, because that's going to be before the next long session. If the state chooses to go forward with this, it would need to be through either a short session bill or some other action.
And Shelby, I did not see you on the agenda for the Coastal Caucus meeting next week. Have you reached out to the chair?
Yeah, Walter Chuck, who is the vice chair of OPAC, has reached out, I think, a couple times. So I don't know what the status of that is right now. We can certainly follow up, but hopefully, if not that meeting, then ideally your next meeting.
All right, good. Thank you.
It's 10:30 right now. I have some ideas to put out there for next steps and assignment of tasks based on some of the challenges before us, but we'll maybe reserve that to the end of the meeting. I do think it would be a good time to take public comment right now, because for folks in the audience or on the phone, a lot of this is really fresh, what we've heard from some of our partners. So we'll put the vacant board seat discussion to after public comment and after the break and continue. So we'll open public comment now.
Thank you very much.
Laura, can I sign up or somehow virtually?
You can sign up right now, Gina. Go for it.
Okay, great. I didn't know if people in the room wanted to speak, so I didn't want to step on toes. So this is Gina Carter. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, longtime OOST fan. All right, thank you, Laura, for stepping up to serve as the interim chair, and also the other members who've continued to contribute your time and passion. I have kind of 4 quick things to raise based on the conversation this morning. One, I have a clarifying question that if you all were to move forward with being the ODFW kind of fundraising partner, doesn't OOST have a requirement that your money leave your entity through a competitive grant program? And how would you navigate that? Because you have your rules and it's all set up, and the statute says it needs to be through a competitive peer-reviewed process. So it sounds like the partnering with the other organization would actually go around that. I want to make sure that how that would work. The other is around, go ahead. Okay, so the other has to do with the Marine Reserve funding, and as Shelby mentioned, it is very important and a kind of urgent need. And I will say that there will probably be in the coming months a pretty good, and in the short session and other opportunities, the NGO lobbying effort and fundraising will probably be focused on that. But it is a continued hope that the OOST could be a potential partner in that, depending on how the funds are structured, in order to receive monies from private entities or NGOs. The third point I have is you mentioned earlier, just because this is a go, no-go discussion, I just wanted to mention that when you asked earlier, Laura, about other entities that could administer a grant program, we've had really good partnerships with the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission in administering either specific projects or competitive grant programs, and they have a very low indirect rate of 3%. So you could maybe add them as a potential partner to explore if you decide at the end of the day not to go for some reason. That could be a path forward for people who are looking for an option. And then the last is, as you think about your new board members of capacity, I hope that you'll think about adding someone who has a background in philanthropy or some sort of private fundraising. And I think that'll maybe help open doors and shape strategy for Boost. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Those are good points and some good questions. Gina, to your first question, whether or not OOST has a requirement to send funds through competitive grant program, that is something I believe we did look into, and while we are, and I'm going to double check this, so I'm going to make a statement and then I'm going to say, but I need to double check it. While we are set up to do competitive grants, I don't think that we are exclusive to that mechanism solely, but I will double check that.
Great, thanks.
Is there anybody else who would like to public comment? Okay, let's take I'm such a short, I'm just a time demon, so let's take a really short break and come back at 20 minutes till. Yeah.
We can't.
Well, what's interesting is that we have a fund in the state treasurer's office, and we also have now the ability to go into relationship with Wordley Community Foundation, which would be a separate bank account, basically, so we can pay out of. So we're not limited to just the treasury anymore.
I think so. I need to read
Yeah.
the bill one more time,
Yeah.
the one that just passed.
Oh,
about
okay.
Being able to get private funds and where they need to be deposited.
Okay.
I would imagine that the trust would manage them because you wouldn't want the state and foundations funds. I mean, that creates a weird dynamic. So I imagine you're right. This is my law school training. Read the statute. Read the statute.
I don't feel like we talked about
No, I know you were at the summit, but I didn't have a chance to. I came on in July, and unfortunately, I mean, it's fortunate, but unfortunate. I took a job as an understate senator starting 2 weeks ago. So, but I'll still be around the legislative world, and my wife loves the coast.
What other senator are you going to work for?
Rob Black. Lake Oswego area. But my wife actually worked in Senator Roman's office in 2015, legislative session, and we got engaged to Cape Perpetual, so we got coast
strong
connection.
coast ties, yeah.
But I admit that I didn't spend much time there as a kid. My family's very mountain oriented. Yeah.
I was not familiar. I mean, tangentially familiar with Boost.
that's where we need real expertise. And that's something that's totally out of my background. It's almost like three members again. So that's all been generated. So if there was a good candidate to fill that fifth position, I would love to see it filled.
Yeah. With the land, I think the land board. We're gonna get started. Christina, we're gonna get started. Right, if we want to come on back up, everybody, we'll get restarted.
That was Steve.
All right, welcome back from your short break. So we are going to talk about our board seat vacancies, of which there are 2. We had our first vacancy was long enough ago. It was a little over a year ago. We had put out an announcement for letters of interest, and we received several. One of those persons is actually in our meeting today, and that is Steve Marks. Steve put in a letter of interest a little over a year ago and kind of thought that maybe we just didn't want him because there was no follow-up. And I explained to Steve when I talked to him on the phone that it was not the case, that we were just in limbo and were unsure during the legislative session what our future was. Now that we have decided and committed to move forward, I'm glad Steve Marks is here. And I'd like to ask him just to come up and maybe just do a quick introduction of himself. And come on up, Steve.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Steve Marks. I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts in Portland, Oregon. We primarily, over the last 8 or 9 years, have worked on fishery management issues on the West Coast, and I also work on fishery management issues in the North Pacific, primarily in the Bering Sea. More recently, we've added to our body of work coastal habitat issues on the West Coast in particular. So we are an advocacy shop, so we do our primary objectives relatives to both fishery management and conservation of coastal habitat is to secure policy outcomes at the state and federal and now increasingly local levels. We, as part of that work, we do fund independent research in pelagic and nearshore environments. So I do have experience in issuing RFPs, developing research plans, so on and so forth. So that is broadly from a professional outlook. That's the perspective I bring. I also grew up in a small fishing town in Alaska and spent the first half of my life as a commercial fisherman, so I do bring that fishing industry perspective as well when looking at research and data needs relative to natural resource management in the marine environment. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys may have about my background, my experience working in fishery management issues. I've worked fairly closely with Dr. Braby on in her role as a voting member of the Pacific Fishery Management Council. She can probably tell you how annoying I can be. But thank you again for the opportunity to be here. Happy to answer any questions, and it's very, very interesting to learn about the role that that OOST, that's a word that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue for me, but
You'll get used to it.
the role that OOST plays in administering the state's priorities with respect to ocean research. learned a lot. I learned more than I knew coming in, than I expected in the last hour and a half, and some of the opportunities that you guys are looking at, as well as some of the challenges you face. So thanks very much for that opportunity.
Great. Questions?
Yes. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the work of Pew Charitable Trust, your position there, and kind of your day-to-day work. You were talking about being more advocacy-oriented. So how would you be, what experience have you had actually looking at different scientific projects and putting together research plans? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you very much for the question. So our primary, our main priority relative to fisheries management has been the implementation of ecosystem-based fisheries management. Within that context, we have undertaken efforts to protect and conserve forage fish on the West Coast. We've undertaken efforts to advance protection of biogenic habitats, and in particular deep sea corals and methane seeps. We have also undertaken efforts to reduce bycatch in some of the fisheries, primarily in the Southern California region that have high incidental catch rates. More broadly, we've sought to advance the utilization of fishery ecosystem plans as a management tool to bring an ecosystem perspective to what otherwise is single species management approach to fisheries. Each one of those buckets or campaigns, for lack of a better word, is based in evidence-based science research. So within that, we have funded research to conduct diet studies, to conduct syntheses analysis of the major forage species on the West Coast, predator dependency relative to each of those forage species, looking at temporal and spatial management of those predator-prey interactions to make sure that there is enough prey in the water to feed the wildlife that our communities depend upon. With respect to bycatch reduction, we have funded research into alternative fishing gear types to avoid some of the high incidental catch rates that occur with, in particular, the drift gillnet fishery for swordfish. On the habitat side of things, we have developed analytical tools, software-based analytical tools to analyze different, the relative benefits of bottom trawl closures off the West Coast, trying to use new information about the location of deep sea coral beds, methane seeps, to think about how best to manage trawl fisheries within that context. We work primarily through universities, so we work closely with the University of Washington and Oregon State University to identify postdocs, experts in the areas that we're interested in. In Alaska, we've worked fairly closely with folks from the North Pacific Research Board, University of Washington, and engaged pretty closely the Alaska Fisheries Science Center on some of the efforts that they are undertaking to look at the rapid ecosystem changes that are occurring in the Bering Sea, and in particular the Northern Bering Sea and Chukchi Seas, and think about how that might inform fisheries management for those major industrial fisheries in that region as things continue to change. I also, the Pew Charitable Trust also manages what's called the Lenfest Ocean Program. They are firewalled off from our advocacy side of the shop, so to speak. But we do work closely with scientists from that program, and they're most often create task force. So several years ago, there was a Lenfest Forage Fish Task Force report that came out with findings about how regional fishery management councils should manage forage species. there have been LENFES task force on effective methods for fishery ecosystem planning, bycatch reduction, marine mammal protection, so on and so forth. So we help shape some of those research plans and think about some of that research, and then try and use the findings to inform our advocacy work. Kind of bounced around there a little bit, but hopefully that maybe gives you a little bit of flavor of our experience.
And so what intrigued you about applying to be an OOST member?
The ability to bring a conservation perspective to thinking about what Oregon's priorities are relative to their not only the research and data gaps that they have on the Oregon coast, but what are some of the outcomes that they'd like to see? What does a healthy marine environment look like for the state of Oregon, and what are people interested in, and how are we going to manage those resources into the future? I think that the institution that I work for, and broadly, and myself in particular, maybe have some thoughts about that, and bring a perspective that really looks at evaluating trade-offs between ecological outcomes, economic outcomes, and social outcomes to try and ensure that the services and benefits that we derive from that marine ecosystem continue into perpetuity.
Jim? Representative Gomberg, if you're still there, do you have any questions?
I'm just unmuting. No, I do not at this point. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming up and introducing yourself. I've known Steve a little bit through the forage fish work that Pew did, and when I was on the Fish and Wildlife Commission, it was really kind of a touching and proud moment for Oregon to see a letter in the Oregonian from the fishing industry, the Oregon Trawl Commission, ODF&W, and Pew writing a letter together saying we did this, we put ourselves to a task, and developing the forage fish management plan was just a win for everybody. I was like, wow, we rock. That was a great moment. And so I think that's a good example of how we can find commonality, even while maintaining our independent beliefs and views. I guess that said, I would entertain a motion to write a letter of recommendation to the Land Board to appoint Steve Marks to our board. It's been a little unclear what the process is for appointing. We haven't appointed anyone new since the original board went in, but I think a letter on our behalf would go a long way.
I would so move. And
I second.
We need to clarify, because we have both 2- and 3-year appointments.
Well, so we have 2 vacant board seats. I would say that whichever seat was Emily's seat, since that was the time that he applied, whether that was a 2- or 3-year appointment, would be the appropriate term. And I would also, we should vote on our motion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And then I would also ask if there is not an announcement posted currently for our 5th vacant seat, if we could get that posted on the Oregon Ocean. It's there still. Have there been any additional applicants? I will see about getting that circulated through the listserv on a more proactive. It's probably just hanging there kind of quietly on a website. So I'll ask if Deanna can get that out through the broader ocean policy listserv, and ask our partners to repost that with great enthusiasm, so we can get that out broadly to the rest of the community.
Laura, I can also send it out through the same listserv that we use to send out the meeting notices for the OOST meetings.
Yeah.
So I'll send it out.
Okay.
I'll just resend it again.
Cool.
But it is on our website, so if you can take a look at it and just make sure that you don't want to make any changes to it before I do that, that would be great.
Okay, I'll take a quick peek at it before I leave today. Thanks again. I appreciate your interest.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully we can work together.
Are there qualities that you would be seeking in a fifth OOST member specific? I mean, it says fundraising in here, but just for our office and Representative Gomberg's office to know if interested people come through.
More fundraising.
Yeah, that is going to be our challenge. So individuals that can help us understand the philanthropic mindset more broadly so that we can be more effective in our messaging and in our outreach, and ideally open some doors so that we can have some conversations with the right people. I think those would be valuable, but I wouldn't want to limit it to that. Good people come in all ways, so it should be fairly broad.
Do we need to take a look at the job description again?
Do we want to do that as a group? Right now, I don't have one printed.
Is it something that could be emailed out to us and we can just maybe have a quick phone call about it? A public phone call?
We could. Why don't we?
Some right now, right?
Why don't we see if we could do it right now? It would be better to probably just take a look at it, make sure we're all on the same page.
Sure, that'd be great.
And I'd like to back up just a little bit. As we develop a process for replacing this seat position, we should essentially codify that because we have another position, and going into the future, we need to have some kind of process in place so we don't have to keep reinventing every time we have a vacancy. So whatever mechanism evolves out of this, I think we ought to refine if we need, but hang on to it.
Okay.
Part of our policies and procedures.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Let me go get that printout. I'll be right
We
back.
have nothing in our policies and procedures now, do we?
We just haven't
They just
had to do
define-
it before.
Yeah, probably not. If there's a vacancy for any cause, the board shall make an appointment to become effective immediately for the unexpired term. I believe that means the land board. Yeah, the land board appoints.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's pretty brief guidance. So I think what you're saying is good, Jim. We should document our process in terms of how we solicit and maybe even if I can attend the land board meeting where they'll be taking this up, ask for some guidance from them on how they would like us to bring forward candidates.
Great. Thank you. It would also be helpful to be reminded what our terms are.
Yes.
4 years.
They were staggered initially.
I thought they were 2 and 3.
It says the term of office of each voting member is 4 years, but a member serves at the pleasure of the board.
And I think when you guys were set up,
That's new.
They did it so that you guys didn't all expire.
They staggered the initial term.
Just the initial term.
The initial
Okay.
terms, right.
All right.
That was my understanding when I took over this role.
That makes sense.
So that way you guys, every 2 years, 2 of you need to be reappointed.
Do we know where we are in the cycle, given that it's been 4 years?
Jim was just reappointed in either December or February of this last year.
No, it should have been 2 years ago because I was initially appointed for a 2-year position.
Okay. So he's in the
So I'm on.
end of his first year and a half. we at almost 2 years now?
We're almost 2 years.
Okay.
In October.
So I will add that to my list.
To your to-do list.
Yes,
Let us know, just so that we know that if we can come to the next meeting, or we need to be reappointed.
Yes.
Well, and if the board approves this nomination, what I just read was that the nominee begins to serve immediately. So
Yes.
Steve would be
To fill the
participating,
remainder of the unexpired term.
starting with our next meeting.
Right, because Emily's term had already expired and has been held open, is my
Oh,
understanding.
so it would be a
And
full
so-
term.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right, and so then we would hold, you know, essentially, the thought is that he would be appointed in December. And then possibly, could be as late as February. I don't know what's on the December land board agenda, yet, or how full it is. So I want to put that out there, maybe February before we can do this. And then I would foresee that the next month UST would hold a meeting so that we can then get him on board and, you know, do the oath or whatever it is that we need to do to have him as an actual active participating member.
All right. The list grows. Okay, so on that list, I'm going to go ahead and skip up to next steps and assignment of tasks. Given the fact that we don't have very frequent meetings, relatively speaking to, it's not monthly, usually it's every 4 months, 3 months. Like to see if the members can give some authority to begin having scoping conversations on some potential projects with funders. I don't think we have a list yet of who to talk to. I think that's something that we need to either leave here with today or set up a special session on. But I do have some proposed broad scale projects. I think it would be good that we're all on the same page with if we're going to go out and have conversations on that are officially on behalf of the UST. I would recommend those four kinds of scoping to be a couple of the things that we've talked about and one thing that we haven't. The first one, we talked generally that we know that there's an interest in. Granted, I'm going to say right now, ODF&W still needs to have its committee and it still needs to set its priorities and so forth. However, the UST can still have conversations with partners about things that we think that we might be able to add some influence to ODF&W. And if we're speaking broadly enough and not with too much specificity, hopefully we can't get too narrowed down. But this first overarching project of understanding nearshore keystone species in an ecosystem-based management context with a particular interest on abalone, kelp, urchin, and talking about the need to bring together a workshop with California and Oregon or even Washington in some cases, and speaking broadly about acidification and hypoxia tie-ins to this research. That would be one. The second one that I want to bring forward, which we didn't talk about yet today, but I believe is quite relevant to the state, is whale entanglement research is a hot priority right now, and I think there's a lot of interest around looking at alternative gear design and development to deter particularly fishing gear and whale entanglement, but we also have a case of buoy, scientific buoy in whale entanglement in the state this year. So it's more broad than just the fishing industry. And Sea Grant recently stepped back from a lead role in facilitating industry science convenings on this as ODF&W is moving into a regulatory realm. And there's an interest for an entity to step up and to put together these kinds of summits where people can continue to get together and talk about what's happening. So that would be a second project I think scoping could begin on. The third being the gap year monitoring that we discussed in detail. And the fourth being just seeking some general administrative funding for the OOST so that we can work on capacity building with either contractors or staff to be able to push this forward. Is there any concerns about those four broad topic areas? Is there anything that we should add to that for right now?
No, those are in keeping with what we've talked about in the past.
Okay. Well, that said, in terms of assignment of tasks, I would be in a position to reach out and have some of those conversations. We know that we can't meet as a group unless there's public notice and so forth, but you can call me, Christina, and you can say, hey, you know, there's this person that you should talk to, or I can call Jim and say, what do you know about this? So we can do some work in the interim and start to build some interest around this.
We do need to, if we want to pursue the Oregon Community Foundation as a fund, we should probably pursue that sooner rather than later. And I'd be happy to help with that.
Okay, that would be great. I believe Louise set a lot of that in place already, but it's something that I would really need help with. We know that we need a $5,000 contribution to initiate that relationship. I had committed Local Ocean Seafoods to do that a year ago, and I'll still stand by that commitment. We make contributions to all kinds of nonprofits and ocean science, and this happens to be near and dear to my heart. So we will use that initial $5,000 contribution from Local Ocean Seafoods to get our contract going with OCF, and I'll use your help on that.
I was with Louise when we went to meet.
Good.
So I'm pretty familiar with
Good.
the way they work.
What other next steps?
Is it?
Yes.
Thank you, Laura.
You're welcome. We had in the past talked about position description, and we had a draft position description for some assistants. I think it's a little premature right now because we don't have funding in place. I'm willing to, when I took the role of interim chair, I had to make a commitment to say that I knew that I was going to be taking something on for an indefinite period of time with a big responsibility, and I'm willing to commit the time to do that. If we don't have a contractor in place in probably 6 months, or a staff person in place in 6 months, that could probably become an issue. There may be a situation where we just, if I'm doing lead work, for example, making contacts and doing, getting the OOST profile out there in a meaningful way, it may just be a matter of having some assistance and hiring an assistant. So I'm just putting that out there that we could possibly find ourselves in 3 months where I'm coming to you saying, can we take, we've got a little bit of money here. I need about $1,000 a month to hire somebody to actually draft grants and go out and pull information and do research and so forth. Does that sound reasonable?
That's acceptable.
Okay. I committed to looking into the Treasury and seeing how much funding we do have right now, and I'll report back on that as promptly as I can. We'll get our terms, we'll see if we can get on the December Land Board agenda and get our terms clarified to all of us. And I'll also verify the statement that I made to Gina Carter that we are not exclusive to competitive grant programs that we can pass through to single client, but I'll check in on that. Do we have other next steps and assignments of task? That's enough. Okay. Do we have any other updates or other business to discuss? Okay. We then would just move on to discussing the next meeting time potential. We always have this situation where we move into the winter where holidays and travel and everything makes things kind of wonky. We, in my opinion, do fairly well on conference calls. I don't think that it's limited us in the times where we've done conference calls rather than being here in person. So perhaps for our next meeting, maybe early December, we'll set up a conference call to see where we're at, but Christina and I will move forward with OCF and we'll move forward on conversations, and Jim will still be out there doing his good work with OAOH. And
I will be unavailable
in December?
early December.
Okay.
Until after the holidays.
Okay.
So early January.
Would we want to go earlier than that? Would we want to say we're kind
When do you
of
become unavailable?
Thanksgiving.
prior to Thanksgiving? We could do a conference call. It's not a huge commitment. Jump on the phone for an hour.
Should be fine.
Let's touch in earlier. Sometimes I feel like we wait too long, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to get a lot of traction. So we'll put out a doodle poll to do a conference call before Thanksgiving. Yeah.
When is the next land board meeting?
Ann, is it December?
The next land board meeting is October 22nd.
Okay.
And then, but the agenda's already set for that. And so then the next one after that is December, the second Tuesday in December.
December 10th.
December 10th. And typically that's when the requirements go, and we have a form that says that OOST recommends that the land board appoint, blah, 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 blah.
Oh, okay.
So by you guys making a motion and approving the recommendation of Steve, then I can go forward and make the land board.
Okay. And if we have more letters of interest that come in the meantime, we can consider those for our Thanksgiving meeting.
But essentially, if we have a November conference call, then Steve will not have been appointed yet. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's correct.
I would like.
So
We will make sure he is invited anyway. Yeah. All right.
That clarification.
Okay. Anything further?
Move adjournment.
I shall, after I thank everyone for coming here today, especially traveling. I'm very excited to work together on this. I'm happy to have a job for the OOST. So thank you, everyone. With that, we'll adjourn.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yay.